Right, so I will start the broadcast, and that should let people in. All right, numbers are going up. Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to get in. The numbers are quite high for this webinar, so we'll just let everyone get in before we make a start. Oh, still going up. So it looks like numbers have stabilized at sort of 330, so nice number of people. So hopefully we have a good conversation today. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today at this CIEEM webinar. My name is Jason Reeves. I'm CIEEM's head of policy. I'll be hosting today. We've got a great panel on today discussing BNG, which I hope is what you're here for. As you know, it's hopefully becoming mandatory from November. So today's discussion is around what next, what needs to happen now, are we ready? Those kinds of questions. We are recording the webinar, so it will be added to our YouTube channel and to the resource hub on the CIEEM website, so you'll be able to go and find it there afterwards. There are other webinars recorded and saved there for you to go and have a look at as well. So on to today, as I said, we have a panel discussion with a great panel. We also have time for an audience Q&A at the end, so if there are any questions you have, please do pop them in the Q&A function. Please use the Q&A function and not the chat. I'll be looking at the Q&A. So on to the panel. We do have an apology today, unfortunately, from Nick White. Through no fault of his own, unfortunately, he's not able to join us today, which is unfortunate from that Natural England perspective, but we've still got three great panelists here, so we'll hopefully work through our questions and topics. So I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves to you quickly and their background and involvement in BNG. So if we can start with Emma, you're first on my screen.
Hi, Jason. Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me along today. So I'm Emma Toovey. I'm the Ecology Director at Environment Bank. So Environment Bank is an off-site provider of biodiversity units for the new mandatory biodiversity net gain regime that's soon to become real life thing. And as an organisation, we're establishing a network of what we call habitat banks across England in order to support that new market and deliver biodiversity units across all regions.
Thanks very much, Emma. Julia.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. So I'm Julia, Technical Director of Nature Services here at Macdonald, and actually started working with CIEEM on BNG back in the day of voluntary biodiversity net gain, and we published our good practice principles with CIEEM and CIEEM back in 2016, and then we worked together on the practical guidance, and we now run the training on biodiversity net gain. And I just want to shout out for anyone who's attended the training course, because what we have is people who are so engaged and passionate and really care about BNG and just wanting to do that right. So if anyone here is on the webinar who's attended one of our courses, or the fact that you're all here means there's such interest and drive to really get this right. So right from the start, when we were talking about good practice, and I'm hoping that will come up today, to now with this amazing position when it's actually becoming mandatory. So yeah, it's been great working with CIEEM and now on the interface of BNG on our major projects. That's me.
Thanks, Julia. And Becky.
Hi everyone, I'm Becky Moberly. I work for the Planning Advisory Service, and I'm leading a project that's getting local authorities ready for biodiversity net gain when it becomes mandatory. So that's very much around kind of web resources. We run events. We've got an event tomorrow on the metric. And we also share those events on our website afterwards, recorded, so anyone can access them. Yeah, and my background, I worked for a long time for Natural England on sort of environmental planning. I was involved in setting up the Biodiversity Net Gain team in Natural England with Nick White, who unfortunately can't be here today. But yeah, so that's my background in terms of BNG, and was involved in the first consultation that came out. I can't even remember when it was, Julia and Emma. But yeah, so that's my background, and I've been at PAS for it's now 2.5 years, which I can't quite believe. So yes.
Brilliant.
Just a shout out for Becky's webpage. If anyone, I'm sure we can put a link in. It's absolutely brilliant. Becky, you do a fantastic job because it's great. You got your frequently asked questions. It is the place if you want to know what's going on. So shout out to your webpage.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we can add that into the notes on the on YouTube and on our website. Brilliant. Thank you. So moving on, we have a list of some questions and topics that we want to discuss today, but also if there's anything that pops up for you as the audience, please do pop them into the Q&A and we'll come back to them. We have got time at the end for that. So we are also assuming that everyone has a basic understanding of BNG. We're not going to do a basic explainer. There is a page on the CIEEM website, but there are other places you can get explainers. But we're going to jump into some of the topics that are probably more pertinent to where we are right here and now in time. So first question really is, are we ready? Who'd like to take that first? I mean, there's several elements to that, and Nick would have had some interesting insights around Natural England, but maybe from a consultant's point of view, Julia, do you think we're ready?
Oh, that is the question, isn't it, Jason? So firstly, are we ready? What for? You know, and we know that we've got the blunt headlines, if you like, about biodiversity net gain, but we don't have everything. So what are we meant to be getting ready for? And I think Natural England are doing an outstanding job in the way that they constantly hold webinars, they constantly update us, because there's a piece there about national government. And so much of this is, well, what are we getting ready for? From my perspective in industry, and working now with consultancy, we can absolutely prepare because we know so much of what biodiversity net gain is. We know that it's about applying the mitigation hierarchy. So that's for us to be armed and ready, if you like, about what are those key habitats that score really highly in the metric, and using the metric really early on. So we advocate for the mitigation hierarchy. We know about the metric. We've got version 4 of the metric, which is close to the statutory metric. So we know that's about botanical skills, UK habitat condition assessments, that lovely little bit, strategic significance. So there's a technical aspects, and we run the training together that we can get prepared for. But what we really know about biodiversity net gain, it's about creating and enhancing wildlife rich habitats. You follow the mitigation hierarchy. Yes, we follow the metric, and yes, we adhere to the rules of the metric, but it's about habitats, and we can absolutely be ready for that discussion. And I think for so long, the 10% BNG, the shorthand, has been really helpful. It's got BNG on the map, it's got it on the tables in the development setting, but we now need to move that conversation on, and we need to talk about wildlife rich habitats, and that's the challenge for our ecology community, because we're now designing habitats. And are we ready for that technical aspect? Are we ready to design woodlands to grasslands too? So it's that design space that I think as an ecology community, it's one of the best challenges that we've had, but it is a challenge. So from a technical point of view, we need to shift up a gear. Yes, there's still obviously all the really important work with protected species and surveys and mitigation, but there's this, okay, we are now designing wildlife rich habitats. So there's the metric and there's that, and those design skills that I think is certainly something that we need to get ready for.
Thanks, Julia. Becky, from a local government perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I ask myself, as I have as sort of my objective of my project is for local authorities to be day one ready. I think it's a question I ask myself all the time. And what is ready? And as Julia says, the issue we have at the moment is we don't know exactly what we're ready for. There is a lot that we can do to prepare, and I think the other thing to bear in mind from a local authority point of view is a lot of them are doing this already. They're already doing biodiversity net gain. They have biodiversity net gain policies in their local plan, or they've started testing it just because developers are coming to them with proposals with biodiversity net gain. So it's not all new to them, but the system under which mandatory will work is new, and we don't have some of the key details there. So for example, at the moment, we don't know what is going to be required at planning application stage to determine that a planning application delivering biodiversity net gain is okay to approve. And obviously for a local authority, that is, a key part of their statutory role in this. So there is, there is various elements, as Julia said. And I think also it's very difficult to say that local authorities are ready. Local authorities come in huge range of shapes and sizes. We have the huge unitaries from Cornwall who had the most planning applications in the country, to some very small districts. And we all know that those, there's a huge funding crisis in local government generally, but also over the years, CIEEM have done a lot of work around this. There's been a real issue around ecology support in those local authorities. That is starting to build up. I mean, you must all see all the adverts that are coming out all the time, which to me is amazing, So, but actually, we have a general issue with capacity in the sector for ecologists, across the board, not just in the public sector. That's going to be interesting. So I think, my personal view is I don't think being ready is a single point in time. I think we will gradually get better and better. And I really, I've said this right from the start of my project, partly to cover my back, this is not going to be perfect to start with. And some of this is only done through testing. I work a lot with Buckinghamshire Council, I should say, as a unitary, who are really far ahead in working through this. And they've said there's a lot of questions and things that have come up only by doing. And one of the things we very much do is share those lessons learned. So hopefully, if you are a smaller authority that's a bit further back on the journey, you can not go down all the sort of dead end routes. So I think we will get the readiness will snowball, because more and more people will start learning, and hopefully they won't go down those dead ends that others have tried, and they can learn from each other. We're definitely not quite ready yet, but I think from a local authority point of view, the main thing we really hear is they really support biodiversity net gain. They're worried about some of the details, and they're worried about the practical application in terms of some applications. I won't go into the details of which now, but there are issues around some, but as a principle, there is a lot of support, and they want to make it work. And that's very much the point. And my LGA colleagues would probably be very frustrated with me if I didn't also mention the funding. So one of the other sides of this is obviously local authority. The government has given commitment for new burdens funding to cover all the Environment Act requirements. At the moment, we don't know what that's going to be. So there has been some interim funding announced. That at the moment, that is only till March 24. In terms of a local authority position, that means if they rely on that funding, they can't recruit a permanent person. That the most recent funding was only announced a few weeks ago. So if you're thinking about, if you want to recruit somebody now, when are they going to come in? They might not come in till November. Oh, they're only employed till March. So there is that funding capacity is a huge issue, and some clarity around that would be, hugely important. So I would not say, I guess my key point is really that being ready is not a single point in time, but I think if we can all work together, we can get as ready as we can be, so.
Emma, from the private sector, landowners, investors, where are we?
Yeah, absolutely. I just reiterate Becky's point there in terms of that practical applied experience. Like, we won't have that in the sector. We won't have that until the button switches on in November, and we learn from doing. And we know that from that kind of transactional space, for example, the purchase of biodiversity units from the private sector and how that interacts and interfaces with the processes internally with the local authority, and what the kind of requirements are to demonstrate confidence through that process. Those things, the nitty-gritty of that, will all come out as we start to roll through into the reality of BNG coming into play after November. But in terms of the market infrastructure, I think there's worth picking up on a few aspects there, that we're certainly, landowners and operators are eagerly waiting for guidance from government in terms of things like the game site register. When will that go live? How's it going to work? Exactly what's going to be required and to be to get that up and running, and various other guidance and the secondary legislation itself. Are there going to be any surprises there that might mean that, you know, that the sector has to pivot and adapt to make sure that they're in readiness for November? So certainly some question marks around some of those aspects, but I really think we're getting there. I mean, CIEEM with Julia and others have done an amazing job in that, getting those that technical training, but at the moment a lot of it's sort of theoretical, a lot of it is working on a small number of projects, but over time, as we build that experience, we'll be even more ready.
Just building on that, and
sorry, if I can just
yeah,
jump in there, because I just want to pick out the really point that I think, and you both mentioned it, it's, Jason, your question about are we ready, the we bit is so important, because Becky, if we know that local planning authorities are thinking, well, what information do we need to make a decision at planning application, we can ask that, you know, we can engage with local planning authorities. So that's our responsibility to double check. It's also our responsibility to make sure that we're being transparent about all the information as well. And Emma, I think it's our responsibility to clearly start articulating our possible demand. So even though you might not know everything from government, it's a simple market demand supply discussion. So are we ready? Jason, it's a really great question, but I think it's that point that Becky picked up on. It's all of us collectively, for everyone involved in BNG, are we helping each other out to be ready?
Thanks, Julia. Just so picking up on that as well, something that a couple of you mentioned around skills and capacity. I was hoping to delve into that a little bit more as well. And when you say we, so maybe a little bit inward looking, but are we as a sector ready? Do we have all the skills? And Julia, I know you've been involved in the training. Do we have the skills necessary? And it was interesting you talked about design as well, as I've generally thought about this around use of the metric, botany skills, habitat assessment skills, but there's so many others that go with it. Do we have the skills, and do we have enough people in the sector ready for this when it comes in? Because this is just going to be a huge burden, a huge demand.
Well, just to start off from an industry point of view, so there's one thing we're talking about this morning, actually, I really love about BNG is that it's a team sport. So from a design perspective, you know, for us as ecologists and biodiversity game practitioners, we should team up with and work really closely with our landscape architects. And so are we ready from a technical point of view? It's us ecologists and really learning and understanding about habitat designs, but also working really closely with landscape architects, because that's also their job. You know, they do a lot of work around designing habitats. So it's like a shared, are we ready as a team? We also work really closely with, you know, everyone involved in a design, because for engineers, if we want to retain that particular woodland, I can't engineer that slope angle or do a bit of, we're talking this morning about directional drilling. That's not my job. So as a team sport, you know, are we ready in terms of, are we communicating with our engineers, and do they have the skills and expertise as well? And are we ready as ecologists, not just in terms of those technical skills, which is metric, habitats, but also designs, but are we ready in terms of having that voice at the table? You know, we speak so much about the ecologists being involved early. What we don't speak enough about is what happens when we get there. What happens when we get a seat at the table early, and do we have the strength of voice and the you know, all those leadership skills and all of those things to clearly drive BNG? Because the sea change is not just now mitigation and, you know, that point when we're mitigating damage. Biodiversity net gain is a design. It's a design, and it's an equally important outcome of the project. And I was working on this EIA project the other day. We were chatting with our EIA coordinator, and he goes, right, you know, we're getting the engineer design team in, and then Julia, your BNG team can come in. Let me stop you right there. I mean, this poor guy, I was honestly, it's like, I'm the design team, you know. It's so we're constantly dealing with that mindset. So there's the skills, but there's also the cultural change in what biodiversity means. And as ecologists, our position, and we really need to talk about this, we're in the design team now. We're driving the design of BNG. That road, that's a constraint to my BNG design. And it's that conversation to have. So Jason, I can talk forever about this, but it, you know, it's the teamwork. BNG, landscape, engineer, we're part of the BNG design, but it's also those leadership skills, communication skills, whatever you want to call it. I'm not going to say soft skills, so I don't think they are soft, but it's that as well as a ecologist now being that driving design in terms of that. if that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Emma, you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to add something?
Well, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Julia said, and I think, you know, when we're looking at off-site biodiversity net gain delivery, also it's a completely brand new skill set for ecologists to work with landowners and land managers, and that very practical sort of on the ground application of long-term land management for a new purpose to sort of deliver the biodiversity net gain outcome. That's a brand new thing for landowners and land managers, and working closely with an ecologist, and that's a new skill set, because actually a lot of ecologists in the consultancy sector haven't had that experience to date, because it's been a different environment. So I completely agree with that team effort, but I think just picking up on in terms of capacity and the number of ecologists with those skill sets, inevitably, because it is a brand new skill set that we are learning. There's been lots of amazing training going on, but inevitably we are low in terms of capacity, and we are getting feedback from developers a lot of the time saying that there just aren't enough ecologists around that have the confidence and have the ability and the confidence to kind of talk about BNG and how it can be applied in a practical way to their development schemes. There just aren't enough of them in the market at the moment, and that can only really come with time and experience. I think we're getting there, certainly, but I think there is a capacity issue there.
Thanks. Becky, did you want to add anything to that before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think just what Julia was saying around a team effort, you know, that's very much the case in local authorities as well. And I think it can traditionally be seen that this is the, you know, if they have an ecologist, you know, this is the ecologist's job, or, you know, this is the environment team's job if they have one. And I think it's very much not, you know, this is very much about planning decisions. So it very much involves planning officers, but it also is very likely to involve legal officers when we're talking about legal agreements. There's the whole question about enforcement, which I will not get onto now, but we may get onto later. But also, just if you're going to have, you know, some local authorities are taking there's a decision for a local authority to make around how involved they get in this and what they do, whether they do the sort of statutory bare minimum or whether they do other stuff to make it, you know, really successful in their area. And, you know, depending on that decision, it's going to potentially involve green space teams, estates, you know, again, more legal work. So, you know, it's really, you know, something that we hear is just definitely about that. So it's not just about upskilling ecologists, it's also upskilling other colleagues. I think the other thing is that we're really interested in is upskilling planners, and this is for BNG, but also more generally around key topics that are coming up now, you know, and not as planners not assuming that if it's environment or ecology, they need to get an ecologist involved. Yes, very much there needs to be that ecological understanding for biodiversity net gain, but there is no way that ecologists are going to be able to be involved in every single planning application that comes into most planning departments on BNG. And so it's upskilling, and a lot of that is, like both Emma and Julia mentioned, is around confidence, and it's having confidence in your decision-making ability. It's having confidence to know when you need to involve an expert. And, you know, I've talked quite a lot about when colleagues involve heritage experts, for example, but planners involve heritage experts, and when they do that, and, you know, it's exactly the same. So I think it's going to be, you know, and again, I was talking yesterday to someone around exactly this, you know, around how a lot of it will be about confidence and having that confidence to you know, to know. So, and, you know, that again comes into what Julia was saying around, you know, those wider skills. It's not necessarily just about the knowledge, it's also about, you know, confidence, ability to speak up, you know, knowing when it's right to sort of get involved and that sort of thing. So yes, I think but I, you know, again, I think as both Julia and, you know, Julia's referred to a lot of examples of when she's been involved in projects, and I mean, the best way to do these things is to learn as you're doing it. And obviously that's not ideal in terms of, you know, things being perfect from day one. But I think that is, you know, probably the best way is to sort of get on and give it a go. And hopefully, you know, if we have the situation where we've got the sort of bigger applications coming in first, that gives a real chance for, you know, to get that practice in before the smaller applications come in. So.
Great, thank you very much. Moving on, Emma, one for you. We've had the government set the statutory B&G credit price eye-wateringly high.
Yes.
Probably
Intentionally.
yes, intentionally, but it then does focus the attention on the private sector. And so
Absolutely, yeah.
the follow-on question is where's that market going? How is that developing?
Yeah, great. I mean, great question. So, of course, Environment Bank, we're very excited about November coming. We've been waiting for this moment for some time, and we spent the last really few years building a network of sites so that we have 3,500 biodiversity units on live sites secured right now. They're on the shelf, and the works on the ground are happening. And by the end of the year, we should have about 10,000 biodiversity units available to sell across the national market. And so when you take FTEC's market analysis that they did a couple of years ago, and they estimated the annual demand of about between 6,000 and 12,000 units a year, we're looking pretty good, just from us as a single provider. And of course, I'll touch on them in a second. There are other operators and suppliers out there. We do have a national supply of biodiversity units off-site emerging now, which is a really great place to be in. I think the other thing to think about is that just in November, of course, it switches on, but there will be a lag between applications going in then and actually when they need the units sort of drawn down, if you like, at pre-commencement. So we've still got a bit of time until the full market's going to be realised and the real demand for biodiversity units to be available is going to reach its peak, and that's likely not to be till next year, I would say, certainly. And of course, there are a lot, as I say, EB is one provider in the market at the moment, but we're seeing lots of local providers. They vary in terms of the status of those projects and where they sit in terms of progression. There are different mechanisms out there. There's great brokerage models and out there where, a matchmaking sort of options put together where land agency perhaps might bring together a developer and a landowner to have a bespoke project. So there's lots of emerging options out there at the moment. I think the two areas of caution, though, and sort of two challenges I see from November onwards are firstly that the reality is there won't be a local off-site option in every local planning authority in every national character area across England by November. I would be absolutely blown away if there was. I think there is a supply available in the national market, but that means, of course, that in the short term, until the private market really gets up and running, there will be a need for cross-boundary selling. And I think we kind of need to prepare ourselves for that and embrace that to a degree in the short term until there is a local option everywhere. And I think the other challenge that we're likely to see in the short term is the availability of those very high distinctiveness units that are more challenging to deliver. They're obviously niche and very high distinctiveness for a reason. Hopefully the demand for them will be significantly lower for the same reason as well. We shouldn't be impacting those types of habitats, but there may be a limited supply of those in the private market. And that means that there might be a need for those statutory credits to kick in situations. But those more typical medium distinctiveness type habitats that a lot of developers are coming to us to ask for, they're available at the national level, I would say.
Great. Julia, Becky, did you want to come in on anything on that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Emma, I'd be really interested. We're also seeing a real shortage in watercourse units. It's
Yes.
really, really difficult. You've got like a 10-meter strip of a river. You can't naturalize that. And
Yeah.
interestingly, those are, priced incredibly high, this statutory credit. So it's really difficult to achieve it on your site. It's really high price for a statutory credit. And I'm only speaking with a very small pool of suppliers, so I'd be interested in what your take is. But a lot of the people that we're speaking with are like, no, watercourses. We'll just do the woodland, the scrub, the grassland, because there's a safe bet there, because they're, no, there's going to be market demand for watercourses. But even when we go to them, we say, well, we've got to get more accredited. And we own this part of the land and there's the river, but there's a landowner on the other side and we've no idea if he's going to be interested or not.
Yeah.
So it's there's a absolute, disconnect between different parts of demand and supply. But I think times that by 100 when it comes to watercourses, and those are the really big statutory net gains. But for me, the watercourses are such the great opportunity, because you can look at a catchment level, you can do some really great things for our rivers with net gain. That to me is a real tricky one.
It's a really tricky one. I mean, we have a lot of sites where we have watercourses. A lot of our sites have watercourses and opportunities for enhancement. But as you say, where we can't control both sides of the watercourse and essentially guarantee those outcomes, it's very difficult for us to make a commitment in terms of the units that are available. We do have river units, ditch units essentially in our stock, if you like, in our stock cupboard, but they're in fewer numbers, and certainly I put them in that very high distinctiveness category in terms of some of those other habitat types as well. They are challenging to deliver. We will have them available, but I think there'll be a limited supply.
Yeah, so you got your, like you say, the medium lot, and then the high, but the watercourses. And the other one as well that I do really worry about developers who are like the small side of medium. So they're not small enough to be exempt from B&G, but they're not big enough to fit biodiversity net gain on their site. And they're the ones who want, like, can I have 1 or 2 units, please? And understandably, when we speak to people who are interested in supplying local habitat units, they want the wholesale, because every single time they get like 1 or 2 unit, please, that add admin costs, and they've got to, how do you stack it? And there's all that kind of uncertainty there. And biodiversity net gain was never meant to penalise those developers who are the small side of medium. They can't afford the statutory credits, and we really need a thriving offset market that can just, whether that's the habitat bank, and they want consistency of pricing. And for me, I think it's like the small pennies in the jar. They will stack up to some amazing conservation work over time, but it's those developers that I'm particularly worried about, because like you say, that it's going to take a bit of a time gap to get the offset market. And even if there is an offset market, rightly so, suppliers were like, well, no, I'm not selling less than 1 or 2 units. I want the wholesale. And over time, if we get the offset market up, there's a mechanism for those to have really easy access to habitat units.
Absolutely, and a habitat banking model is really beautifully designed to support those developers, because we are able to sell small numbers, even fractions of a single unit, but a lot of that more brokerage model is unable to support that. Yeah, totally agree.
And it's something we hear a lot from local authorities, and it's interesting, those that are already doing B&G often have systems in place where they can take contributions direct for those, because we hear about it's not even 1 or 2 units, it's 0.2 of a unit, it's very, very small. And obviously under the new system, it's going to be more difficult to follow that contributions model, because you'll have to follow it through the register. There are ways to do it, but it's just more tricky, because you've got to have a direct link between the set, the units that you're providing and the development where they're lost. I think, again, this is more, a personal point of view. I think there are some questions to be asked about the national credit scheme that doesn't need to do that, but potentially local schemes, that already can demonstrate those links, but potentially are going to be made, washed away by the legislation. And I think this is one of the things where, obviously hugely supportive of it becoming mandatory, but actually sometimes it can, where you're further ahead in terms of doing stuff, it can sometimes potentially the mandatory system is pulling you back rather than taking you forward, which is quite interesting. But that's a whole other point which I won't go into.
Thank you. There's an interesting point that sort of popped up, and it's something that comes up again and again, is this dichotomy between on-site and off-site delivery. And Emma, I know you're obviously involved in the delivery of the off-site, but have we got the balance right? The metric pushes in one direction, obviously, with favouring on-site and then local and then further afield. Emma, you talked about the difficulties with having things that are local to particular sites. Are there issues with that as well now?
I mean, I think let's remember that the whole kind of regime of BNG really needs to rely on the spatial and mitigation hierarchy. If we dismiss that, then we're essentially moving towards that license to trash model, which I don't think any of us want that. I think it's really key that we remember that minimization and avoidance of biodiversity impact has to be core to what we're doing here. But I think the reality is that I think strict adherence to the mitigation hierarchy and spatial hierarchy to always prioritize on-site delivery of BNG won't always give the best outcomes for nature, because sometimes biodiversity delivered on-site ultimately will be compromised. So I think it's about understanding that as a sector, really being honest and truthful about what can meaningfully and tangibly be delivered with great outcomes on site, or even moderate outcomes on site, but just being honest about that, rather than and then, you know, maximizing opportunities off site where possible to give us the greatest bang for our buck, and really meeting all of those Lawtonian principles of bigger, better, more joined up. So it's a balance, isn't it? But I do think we need to recognize those nuances.
Becky, Julia, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I just totally agree with Emma. I think it's about being really honest, and I think this is where the debate falls apart and people get into on-site versus off-site. And I think it's because nature recovery wasn't around as a concept. I mean, obviously it existed, but we weren't using the words nature recovery when we first started doing biodiversity net gain. Biodiversity net gain was not invented to solve the nature crisis or to do nature recovery. It's about the fact that if you don't have protected species on a site, and actually sometimes even if you do, but don't tell anyone because they're not always known about, or a protected site, the biodiversity is lost completely. You know, yes, there are policies in place, but generally, unless that's very well applied, it's lost. So I think, you know, and that was about the continuing decline of nature. You know, so I think for me, there's something about what are you trying to do through doing biodiversity net gain? And hopefully as a local authority, you will have a variety of different objectives that you're trying to meet. Now, some of those may be more around green space for people in urban areas and things like urban cooling, nature-based solutions. Now, you know, BNG can help drive those alongside addressing the nature crisis. But I think, as Emma says, you need to be really, really honest about what that's actually going to deliver if you're doing it on site, you know, and probably it's not going to deliver, you know, very, very high quality, you know, habitat that is vulnerable to people, accessed by people and dogs, you know, realistically, no. So I think for me, it's about, you know, it can touch all those objectives, but it is not going to solve the nature crisis on its own. And it really frustrates me because, yes, it can contribute and that would be brilliant. But I think, again, it's where we'll learn more through time. And we'll see, you know, at the moment, we don't really know what the balance of offsite and onsite is going to be. You know, there's all these questions. And I think, again, we can get better and better at this over time. But I think, you know, I think by suggesting that it should be offsite first to deliver nature recovery, we're in some ways shooting ourselves in the foot and then saying, oh, well, it's all right, because if we do BNG, the nature crisis will be solved, which we definitely know it won't. So I think, you know, it needs to be part of a huge range of other aspects to work. So I think, you know, I get a little bit frustrated by, you know, some of those arguments around it, because it's got to be a balance across the board. And I think over time we will work out what works best in different places. It will be different in different places.
Yeah, and just to echo that, I think it's a very unhelpful narrative, you know, the on versus offsite, because our good practice principles for biodiversity net gain actually said, what's the best outcomes for nature, right? And make your decisions, whether it's on or offsite or a mixture of both, based on that benchmark. And Becky, you're absolutely right. You know, our good practice principles talked about making a contribution. So what's the contribution we can make to nature recovery, which is this incredible work being done? And our aspect is to make a contribution, but the guiding light is what's the best outcomes for nature versus what's going to be really practical. We know under mandatory net gain, there'll be that delay with the offset markets. So offsite might not be an option in some localities until a little bit down the line. But I agree with you. I think it's a mixture of best practice, what's the best outcomes for nature, versus the practical reality, and absolutely being transparent about what we can achieve on site versus the practical reality. And that's why I'm so keen to support a thriving, great offset market, so we can have that balanced approach. And that's where everyone wins.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm keen for us to move on. We've had lots of questions come in, so let's try and get to those. I've got two more things I think I'd like to cover before we start on the question. So one is back to you quickly, Emma, but as a wider topic. So around stacking and bundling of credits, and whether investors are seeing the nutrient neutrality announcement as a something that might get in the way of investments. But then a sort of add-on question to that is, how do we add in further benefit for other things that may not necessarily be a financial benefit in terms of investors, but thinking about the sort of mental health, access to nature, those kind of things that maybe Julia and Becky can come in with afterwards. But Emma, I'd just be interested in your views on whether investors are nervous now about where government might change things.
Okay, so in short, no, I would say investors, I think let's remember we can differentiate. The BNG regime is very different to the nutrient neutrality sort of market that's been emerging. Of course, BNG is going to be mandated in law. It's part of the Environment Act. It's all in black and white. It's been through Parliament, and it's had a long time getting to this point. We have the market infrastructure in place, and it's in a fantastic place. Nutrient neutrality has come from a very different place. Actually, it was really triggered from technical guidance issue from Natural England, and I wish Nick or Maria were here to sort of touch on that sort of history there behind where it's come from. But it's essentially based on case law, and certainly in terms of our funding environment, it was always felt more fragile, and it's also a much smaller area across England, which landowners could even have accessed that market anyway, because of the very specific catchments within which were vulnerable to nutrients. So yes, there will be landowners that have been impacted by that decision. Does it undermine the future of nature markets? I don't think so. I think the BNG regime is really robust. It's brought loads of confidence to private investment, and I think it has a bright future. So I'm not worried, but I feel bad for some of the landowners that have lost a revenue stream there. On the wider point, Julia and Becky want to come in, but I mean the wider benefits of increasing nature across the nation are sort of significant. Where to stop? I mean, we're on many of our sites we're measuring the, whilst we're not generating carbon credits, we're measuring the carbon benefits of our projects. There's natural flood management, there's cooling effects, particularly for on-site delivery of BNG. You're going to see brilliant air quality regulation impacts. Of course, there's the social and welfare value of these kinds of projects. It's multifunctional, and that's why nature's awesome, because it isn't just about climate and carbon, it's about all of this whole range of amazing benefits. So it's win-win-win, really, isn't it?
Thank you. Julia, Becky, want to add anything to those?
Yeah, I was just going to say, really, just picking up on the point that Julia made, it's a lot of it's about design, and, if you design it right. But I think, again, Emma's right. We package these things separately. So we package biodiversity net gain separate to SUDs, separate to, other natural capital benefits. I mean, I always give the example, I happen to have a tree just outside my window, and I always look out and when I'm talking about this and say, right, that tree has not decided that today I'm going to be a biodiversity unit. Tomorrow I'm going to provide a bit of flood risk mitigation. And maybe on Wednesday I will, provide some air pollution benefits. Ecosystems just do it, and habitats just do it all at once. Now, obviously, you need to think about that and the different types of habitats you're using and where you're putting them. And that really comes back to the point Julia made about design. But it's a really human instinct to compartmentalize things like this. That's not how nature works. Nature doesn't go, You know, it's not in compartments, it's not in categories. We love doing that as humans. But so for me, in itself, biodiversity net gain, no matter, you know, what you do, will provide other benefits, because people love seeing nature, you know, albeit maybe as an ecology, you know, nature that perhaps some of us don't value. You know, it may be a pigeon. Again, I can see a pigeon from my roof, you know, but people love that. So I think that in itself just provides a benefit, whatever. But the better you design it and the better you think about it at that early stage, the more you will get those benefits. So yeah, Julia.
Yeah, it's design, definitely. It does help when mandatory policy has that linkages. It really does help. And then it does help if and then I've seen some amazing local plans that make the connections and the links within the local plans as well. But absolutely, as a sustainability professional, my job is to also make those linkages. It's not just about the benefits, though. You've got to think about your baseline. So if I have 2 hectares of woodland on the baseline, we'll apply the mitigation hierarchy, but just say that's cleared, there's a loss of carbon sequestration and a loss of carbon sinks. So under biodiversity net gain, you then get the biodiversity net gain over 30 years. Does that biodiversity net gain pay back that loss of carbon sequestration? So there's the wider benefits, but we also have to think about everything that we've lost, everything. Those woodland might have been accessible by people, and the biodiversity offsets over there. So there might be social impacts. So there's a lot of talk when we get to B&G. People look here at B&G, and that's great, and that's really important. But we do need to also think about the baseline and everything. Becky, you just said, everything that nature does, what have we lost? It does help if it's in mandatory policy or in local plans, and there's some brilliant local plans around that. But I think that's my responsibility as someone working in sustainability to also make those connections as well.
Great, thanks. You mentioned the 30 years there, and so the last question before we get on to some of the audience questions was just around this enforcement and monitoring. We've got that 30-year time frame. We haven't had much in the way of detail of how that's going to be enforced, how it's going to be monitored, how we're going to ensure delivery. Without being able to ask Nick, perhaps what's being put in place and where statutory instruments and secondary legislation is, what would you like to see as, you know, in order to secure that 30 years and beyond for biodiversity? Becky, let's come to you first.
I think it's something we're all going to have to work together on. So a personal frustration of mine was to see in the consultation response that it said enforcement is all on local authorities. Now, a lot of people don't realise, but enforcement is not a statutory duty of a local authority. So they get no funding to do enforcement, and particularly not over a 30-year timescale. Now, they can recoup monitoring. So when I say monitoring, that's not monitoring the actual habitat, but I guess checking on the habitat monitoring, that's their role. They can recoup that if they've got a Section 106 agreement, so that's a planning obligation. So they can recoup that through cost. You can't recoup funding through a planning condition. So there's a real issue potentially around on-site delivery that's secured through planning condition. And I think it's going to be something we really need. I mean, it's absolutely key to me. You know, you can spend all the time you want on getting, you know, all your plans right, checking those plans, you know, when you approve them. If it doesn't deliver in the end, it's pointless. And if it doesn't deliver for that timescale, it's going to be really key. But I think the key plea for me is to not just put it on local authorities to do it. As we've talked already, there are, you know, huge capacity and skills gaps. How can we work together to resolve this issue? The current enforcement system, even if it were funded appropriately, actually doesn't really work. I was talking to some enforcement officers a couple of months ago. It doesn't really work for that 30-year timescale for various reasons, which I won't get into now. You know, so that there are issues with the current system that BNG doesn't slot nicely into. And we know already that on-site management of green space, parks, you know, playgrounds, all that sort of thing is not great. But I think sometimes that narrative can come across as, well, we shouldn't be doing it at all on site because it doesn't work. And my view is, no, let's not do that. Let's try and solve those issues. And how can we sort them out? Maybe in the current system, or maybe by pushing for that current system to change, so that because this is going to be an ongoing problem. It's not a problem just for biodiversity net gain. And, you know, that's another side of it really, is there are issues with the planning system and how it deals with the environment generally. Biodiversity net gain is not going to solve all of those. So there are issues we've been aware of for years and years. And so let's work together on all of those. So yeah, my plea really is just, let's work together on it, and let's not start criticizing each other. You know, I hear sometimes, you know, oh, local authorities are not pulling their finger out on this, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what can you do to help? What can you do to help them? You know, and as Julia and Emma have both said. So, you know, I think it is going to be, I wouldn't want to put the ball in any one person's court on that. I think we are going to have to work it out together. And, you know, there are some really brilliant examples of how local authorities are looking at that and thinking about the monitoring over the, you know, over that long scheme. There's some brilliant providers of schemes. I won't mention anyone in particular, but businesses who are providing the tracking systems that local authorities will need, because there's going to be, you know, with all these applications, all of them having monitoring reports over year and year, that's a huge workload, you know, to actually track that. And there's some great things out there. But, you know, what would be wonderful for me is if we could have some systems that work for everybody that are available nationally rather than everyone having to look at it individually. So yeah, that, you know, anything we can do to work together on that would be great.
The sites register, including on-site and off-site, would probably be a good idea for that.
One that would be a definite start, Jason. Yes.
Julia.
You know, I was waiting to see if someone would mention whether the off-site register should also be on-site. Yes, yes, absolutely. I don't think we'll let that one go. But anyway, it's so important. I mean, you are kidding me. We have come all this work, all this year, especially by everyone on this call, and now we're here. We absolutely need monitoring. I mean, if you speak to anyone, particularly in the design aspect, you know, you just produce the greatest designs, and then what happens out there. One of the things, though, I'm really keen about the monitoring and enforcement is bioconfidence. So there's the monitoring and enforcement for the purpose of have that biodiversity net gain, that development was consented for, has that actually worked? And learning, it's over 30 years, so how that's going to work under climate change, under all these things. So there's a value in that. But actually, for developers confident, if there's a market that's really well regulated, that's when we get that buyer confidence. And it just helps. It really does. So I think it's absolutely key. My one final point is that I think we should be proportionate. You know, let's really target in and let's really focus in, because we're not going to get 100% every single resource that we ever need to do all the monitoring. So let's be proportionate and targeted on the stuff for biodiversity that matters.
Emma, did you want to add anything on that?
I think those points are beautifully covered, but I just wanted to add that as a sector, and maybe this is something that CIEEM can get involved with, but in particular, like what does a good look like in terms of monitoring, and setting some great standards and precedents in terms of monitoring schedules that local authorities feel confident is going to be effective, and that they can essentially get the suppliers and operators tied into, and set very high standards across the market. I think the other thing that's going to be interesting to watch over the coming months is whether or not responsible bodies emerge, and we get to use conservation covenants, which essentially is a similar or almost replicate agreement to a Section 106, but it means the burden doesn't have to sit with the local planning authority, but another competent organisation that can take on that responsibility too. If we do have a great network of responsible bodies nationally, then that would help to share that burden. I know there are also some concerns and worries probably from local authorities there, as they may lose some level of control over BNG delivery locally, but I think anything there that can help share that burden can potentially be very positive.
Brilliant, thank you. Let's jump into some questions. So most of the upvoted questions are all around enforcement and monitoring. So hopefully we've covered most of those ideas. There's one maybe for you, Emma, around how is BNG going to fit with countryside stewardship funding? Is that something that's come up with landowners with you? Do they fit together?
Yeah, absolutely. So it comes down to principles around additionality. A landowner can't be paid twice for delivering the same thing. So it certainly wouldn't exclude us working with a landowner, but in most cases, any stewardship payments that are being taken for essentially habitat enhancement and creation type payments, they would cease, and our payments then would follow and on top, and you wouldn't be able to take both at the same time. There are still, however, subsidies payments that can be stacked when they're in relation to different types of things. So conservation grazing herds or dry stone walling subsidies, or in some cases we can ensure hedgerow payments can be still secured in tandem. So it depends on the site, but in the main there is a conflict there in terms of additionality principles.
Becky, one for you. You talked about lesson learned earlier, and there's a question here around lesson learned. Is there going to be a repository somewhere where people can access information? I know CIEEM, we're redeveloping our pages at the moment, so hopefully create that. Paz has already got some great pages. You'll continue to develop those, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So we already share best practice on our website. So we've got, for example, Julia talked about local plan policies. We've got examples of those. We've got examples of Section 106's conditions, developer guidance notes. I mean, in terms of the sort of ongoing learning as you go along, we are pulling together some examples through some readiness work we're doing for local authorities. But if you are a local authority officer, you can join our practitioner network. So that's specifically for officers. It's private to officers. So people ask what they say are stupid questions, but very rarely are. There's so many questions around this topic. And that's where a lot of that practice is shared. So we had a meeting yesterday, for example, which focused on Section 106 conditions and conservation covenants. So that's where that's sort of being shared. So yeah, as a local authority officer, we're not sort of compiling those lessons learned as a sort of formal report or anything, because it's not quite like that. It's kind of learning as you go along. And also there's unfortunately a capacity issue for us as well, because there's literally just me and one of my colleagues one day a week. So, but yeah, that's the sort of best way. So hopefully over time we can feed into the CIEEM work as well, you know, in terms of that. And I'm sure it will, because there'll be, I mean, loads of LPA officer folk are also CIEEM members as well. So
that's great, thank you. All these questions keep moving around with the updating. Where was the one I wanted next? Ah, yes. So ecological monitoring. Someone's put in here a question around 5 year plus interval seems to be too far apart, and I wondered if you had any views on that for BNG monitoring.
I can jump in. Probably the annoying answer is it does depend. You know, it depends on your habitat, it depends what you're monitoring, it depends where you are, it depends on how much you're subject to climate change. I would say in the first years, particularly if you're looking for creation or enhancement, that immediate aftercare period is really sensitive and really valuable, and you just need to be on it to make sure that it is established in that respect. And then it might be again, it's very general, that when habitats become more established, you know, you can reduce the frequency of your monitoring, but the annoying answer is it does depend.
So there's a question here then, thank you, around severely polluted rivers, waterways within an LPA. Could BNG credits could BNG as a process be used to leverage correction for this? So rather than habitat creation, improving the biodiversity value of those individual habitats?
So, I mean, generally, it's a great question, because, you know, with the very broad brush, 2 options for achieve net gain: create wildlife rich habitats or enhance them. And absolutely. So if there is the metric comes with a lot of rules, so you do have to match up the rules of the metric, and you do have to look at what we talked about, proximity and things like this. But on a kind of very high level, if your developer or your development does need watercourse units and it aligned with the metric, enhancing the condition of an existing watercourse could generate the units that you need. But create habitats and enhance them, yeah, can't go wrong.
Great. Maybe one for you, Emma. There's 2 interrelated questions here, and it's around if a landowner has signed up to BNG but then sells the land partway through that agreement, what happens? And the other one then is with a developer, and maybe one for you, Julia. If a developer folds partway through that process, how do we make sure that 30-year period is still delivered?
I'll take the first question. So if a landowner is committed to delivering BNG off site, then the land would need to be bound through the Section 106 agreement or a conservation covenant. And those legal agreements essentially stay with the land. They become a charge on the land under the land registry, so that in the event that a landowner sells the land or it or dies and passes it on to other family members, the purpose of that land for that nature conservation purpose for that land stays with the land. So whoever then takes over the land has to essentially still adhere to the agreement in place, which is a good thing. The developer, Julia was going to touch the developer question.
That's okay, Julia.
Well, so this is if the developer
if the developer folds for some or other reason, declares bankruptcy, if they still have obligations, what happens, or are they paying up front?
Yeah, I get asked this question so much, and a lot of the team now with B&G, and I'm really now strict in the sense of, look, ask me about the metric, ask me about habitats, and for that question, I have the same question, and that's a legal question or that's a commercial question, and this is mandatory B&G. You need the right expertise. So I'm asked, you know, what does B&G look with planning? That's great. There's planning experts who can really help you. How does biodiversity net gain cost? I can point you in the direction of the statutory credits. If you really want to know how much it costs, there's a brilliant economics team about that. If you want to know about contracts, about legal, I just think as biodiversity net gain, I'm sure many people on the call, you get asked every single question that is about mandatory net gain. And this is a really good example to say, I'm not the best person to ask you. I'm answer that. I'm really not. You know, my happy places metrics and habitats, but this is mandatory net gain. And the point is, we need those experts to come to the table. And that's why it's not just about an ecologist. It is about planning expertise. It is about contracts. You need some really good commercial person. There are some amazing lawyers that I spoke to who could rattle off that question, you know, like that, because they're doing it and they're doing fantastic work to wrap that in terms of their contract. So it's signed, sealed. I'm not a lawyer, but ask that question. Definitely ask it. Just ask it to the right person.
Brilliant. I'm very conscious of time, that we are already over by 4 minutes, but I've got one more question for you that's a little bit of a hypothetical and maybe slightly unfair, but a really interesting one that I think is, do you think we're likely to see mandatory B&G or their equivalents in the other devolved nations of the UK?
I was in Wales yesterday, so I can quickly jump in. I really, really love the discussions that are happening in Wales and Scotland. So Wales, we've got net benefits for biodiversity. Scotland, there's net positive. And these emerging policies for me are such an exciting place. In Wales, for example, we talked yesterday, the policy emphasis is on ecosystems. So moving away from individual habitats to ecosystems. Then it's on ecosystem resilience. And then it's on development playing the part in tackling the joint climate and nature crisis. So that's that point. And Emma, you were talking about it. Well, how do we design biodiversity net gain in ways that increase carbon sequestration? And having that as a policy discussion. So I love the way that, yes, we've got England biodiversity net gain, but Scotland and Wales are really looking at this and asking their questions that are very personal and relevant to them. And I'm really excited to see as these policies emerge. I mean, Scotland's published the NPF4, but I think it's great and a really exciting place to be. And I think they'll soon probably overtake us in England. Anyway.
Yeah, I think they're almost looking at us and seeing what's going wrong and going, like, we'll do it slightly differently. So yeah, I was at a workshop about a year ago where we had folk from NRW and SNH there, and you know, they were really interested in how it was going, but I think they were privately taking notes of what not to do rather than, you know, but I think that's it. You know, I think it's really interesting to watch.
Last word to you, Emma.
Yeah, agree. I think that was covered brilliantly. I think there will be a version of a similar type of policy in all devolved nations and beyond across Europe. And I think we're doing an amazing job in England at setting a precedent that others can follow. But I think it will look different. And I think that's the right thing as well, because each framework that emerges needs to be take into account the priorities of that nation, and that's why there'll be a different metrics and there'll be different focus for those policies as they emerge. So yeah, it's exciting times.
There's certainly a lot of interest in the Republic of Ireland as well, so we'll see where that goes. Brilliant. We are definitely over time, so thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. As I said, we have recorded today, so it will go onto the website so you can go back and watch it. Thank you for all of the questions, and sorry we couldn't get through all of them. But thank you for adding those, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Bye everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.